A little boy hid a note in a stranger's pocket. When the stranger read the message and followed the clues, what he found left him terrified. The cold wind of the city blew fiercely that night, and the sound of dry leaves scraping along the deserted streets echoed in Logan Bennett's mind. He pulled his jacket tightly around his neck, but the autumn chill crept through the worn seams, piercing down to his bones. Logan stuffed his hands into his pockets, trying to ignore the feeling of loneliness that seemed to envelop him every time he left the office and headed towards his small apartment. Not too long ago, his life had been completely different. He had a home filled with laughter, a wife he thought he loved, and above all, his little daughter Lucia, whose laughter brightened even the greyest of days. But now, all that remained were painful memories and the monotony of a tedious job that barely managed to distract his mind from the guilt spiral he was trapped in. The divorce hadn't just taken away his family, it had also shattered his sense of stability. Now, he could barely see his daughter for a few hours on weekends, only when the court and his ex-wife, Carolina, allowed it. As he walked along an almost empty avenue, he thought about how ironic it was that his world had shrunk to these lonely night walks. The neon lights of the bars on the corner flickered erratically, and the muted murmurs of conversations inside barely cut through the silence around him. He quickened his pace, wanting to reach his solitary apartment as soon as possible, when he saw something that made him stop. A little boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was walking in his direction. He was alone. The hood of his grey sweatshirt covered most of his face, and his shoulders were hunched as if trying to disappear. Logan barely paid attention, accustomed to seeing the sad scenes of the city and the tragedies he always tried to avoid. It wasn't unusual to see children wandering alone at that hour, but there was something about the way this boy walked that made Logan frown. The boy was moving hurriedly, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if he were running away from something or someone. Just a second later, when they were almost face to face, the boy stumbled and bumped into him. It was a slight bump, almost imperceptible. The boy wobbled, muttered a barely audible "sorry," and hurried away, now moving even faster. Before Logan could say anything, the little one had vanished into the crowd of aimless people on the sidewalk. "What the heck?" Logan muttered, shaking his head. There was nothing strange, he told himself, just another kid. But a pang of unease ran down his spine as he resumed his walk towards the bus stop. The incident soon faded from his mind, preoccupied as he was with his own dark thoughts and his urge to get home. He reached the stop and waited for the bus under the flickering lights, feeling more and more drained. That night, when he finally reached his small and depressing apartment, he collapsed onto the bed without bothering to turn on the lights. His home was a bleak place, as empty as he felt inside. With a sigh of resignation, he sat on the edge of the bed and took off his jacket. But just then, as he took the keys out of his pocket, something else fell to the floor. "What?" Logan bent down and picked up a small, crumpled piece of paper, dirty and worn. He didn't remember putting it there. He raised it to eye level, and under the dim street lamp light filtering through the window, he could make out some shaky letters. He smoothed out the paper, and when he read what it said, he felt his stomach clench and his heart pound wildly. "Please, help me. I'm being held captive. My name is Parker." Logan's pulse quickened instantly. He read the note over and over, expecting the words to fade or morph into something that made sense. But they didn't change. The handwriting was childish, with crooked lines and words written in desperation. Images of the boy's frightened eyes flashed through his mind, and then he understood. The boy had bumped into him on purpose. He had slipped the note into his pocket, hoping he would find it. "This can't be," he whispered. He stood up abruptly, clutching the paper tightly. What was he supposed to do? Was it a joke? Was the kid just playing? But there was something in those words, something in the urgency of the handwriting that wouldn't let him ignore it. Logan slumped into the kitchen chair with the lone bulb overhead flickering weakly. He stared at the note again and again, as if the letters could offer him answers. "What the heck does this mean?" he asked aloud, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He tried to recall every detail of the boy, his hoodie, the look of fear in his eyes, and how he had disappeared into the darkness, as if he knew he had to hide. Logan's instinct told him this wasn't a joke. That kid was really in danger. But what could he do? He was just an ordinary man, unable to even keep his own family together. How could he save a stranger? Doubt and confusion overwhelmed him, but when he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter Lucia's face. If she were in danger, if she needed help and depended on a stranger to save her, the thought chilled his blood. Logan knew what he had to do. The next morning, he would go to the police station. He had to hand over the note. Someone had to be able to do something, right? But at the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that things wouldn't be that simple. That night, Logan couldn't sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw Parker's lost gaze and imagined the worst. Something was very wrong, and he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Logan woke up feeling as if he hadn't slept a single minute. He got out of bed slowly, with tense muscles and a mind clouded by anxiety. Parker's crumpled note was still on the kitchen table where he had left it the night before, and looking at it, that sense of unreality washed over him again. What kind of child writes a cry for help and hides it in a stranger's pocket? How desperate must he have been? He shook his head and got ready hastily, feeling that every passing second was crucial. Determined, he grabbed the note and headed to the nearest police station. He had to do something. If there was even the slightest chance that the child was in danger, he couldn't ignore it. The police station was relatively quiet when he arrived. The strong smell of stale coffee and the soft hum of phones filled the air. Logan walked to the main counter, clutching the note in his hand. A middle-aged officer, his uniform disheveled and his eyes bloodshot with fatigue, looked at him apathetically. "How can I help you?" the officer asked, not looking up from his computer. "I want to file a report," Logan said, swallowing hard. His heart was pounding. What if they didn't believe him? "All right, wait a moment," the officer responded, typing a few keys and finally lifting his gaze towards him with indifference. "What is this about?" "I found this." Logan unfolded the crumpled note and placed it on the counter. "A child slipped it into my pocket last night. It says he's in danger, that he's being held captive. I think he needs help." The officer picked it up lazily and read the words with the same bored expression. Then he sighed and looked up at Logan, clearly skeptical. "And when did this happen?" "Last night, around 9 on San Martin Street," Logan replied quickly. "I saw the boy. He was alone and bumped into me. When I got home, I found the note in my pocket. He has to be in danger, can't you see?" The officer sighed, as if he were listening to a neighbor complain about a teenager's loud music. "Look, sir, there are lots of kids running around alone. This is probably just a prank. Why did you think this was an emergency?" The disbelief and frustration began to burn inside Logan. Were they not taking him seriously? How could they react with such apathy to something like this? "Because it's a little boy," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "What kind of prank would this be? Look at it carefully. Does it seem like a game?" The officer leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "Without additional proof, there's not much we can do. Maybe you should have looked into the situation more closely before coming here and making a fuss." Logan felt the rage beginning to cloud his vision. 'Cause a fuss? A child was in danger, and this officer didn't even want to lift a finger. But before he could argue, the officer shrugged and added, "Listen, if you see anything strange or happen to run into the kid again, let us know. But for now, I suggest you go back home and try to relax." Logan clenched his fists. He forced himself to hold back. Insisting further would be pointless with someone so uninterested. He took the note back, taking a deep breath to calm himself. "Fine. Thanks for nothing," he snapped, turning and storming out of the station. The cold morning air hit his face as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to cool the fury burning inside him. How could they be so insensitive? That child was in danger, and the officer had the nerve to tell him to relax. He walked aimlessly for a few minutes, trying to clear his head, but all he could see were images of Parker, alone, scared, and with a desperation in his eyes that no one should experience at such a young age. After a while, his frustration turned into steely determination. If the police weren't going to do anything, he would have to find out the truth on his own. Logan returned to the place where he had seen Parker last night. San Martin Street, usually bustling with commercial activity, was now deserted at that early hour. The shops were still closed, and only a few passers-by moved through the area, most of them in a hurry, oblivious to their surroundings. He began speaking to the few shop owners he found. He explained that he was looking for a little boy, describing him in as much detail as he could remember: the grey hoodie, the worn-out jeans, and that frightened look in his eyes. Some gave him strange looks, others ignored him entirely. But Logan didn't give up. He went door to door, shop to shop, until he came across a small flower shop on the corner of the street. The owner, an elderly woman with grey hair pulled into a bun, observed him curiously. "Excuse me, have you seen a little boy around here?" Logan asked desperately. "He was alone. Maybe he passed by here last night." The elderly woman thought for a moment, her wrinkles deepening as she frowned. "Last night?" she asked slowly, moving her lips thoughtfully. "Yes, I think I saw him. Was he wearing a hoodie? Poor child, he looked so scared." Logan's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, that's him. Did you see him alone?" "No, actually, I saw him approach a black van parked over there." The elderly woman gestured vaguely to the other side of the street. "There was a man inside. I couldn't see his face, but the boy just stood there, watching from a distance, like he didn't know whether to approach or not. Then he ran away." Logan felt a mix of relief and fear. There was someone else involved. Was that man the one holding him? And if so, was he looking for the boy again? "Do you remember anything else about the van?" Logan asked, leaning closer to the elderly woman. She shook her head slowly. "No, I'm sorry, son. I didn't catch the license plate or anything else. But I'll tell you this. The boy looked very scared. If you find him, please, take care of him, will you?" Logan nodded, swallowing the lump forming in his throat. He thanked the elderly woman and began walking again, but this time with renewed purpose. He had a lead: the black van. At least it was a start. Back at his apartment, Logan collapsed onto the bed, his mind racing. He had to find that child. Something inside him demanded it. He couldn't fully explain it, but he knew that if he did nothing, the image of Parker would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took out a notebook and started jotting down the details: the street, the van, and the approximate time he had been spotted. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had before. He would need help if he wanted to get somewhere concrete, but he didn't know who to turn to. The police wouldn't take him seriously, that much was clear. And he was just an ordinary man, with no resources or investigative skills. But that wouldn't stop him. Logan stood up and looked out the window. Somewhere out there, that boy, Parker, was waiting. A promise burned in his chest: "I will find you, no matter what it takes." The next evening, as the bustle of the city began to die down and the streetlights cast long shadows in the alleys, Logan felt his anxiety grow with every step he took, venturing into areas he had never set foot in before. He had spent the last few hours searching every corner of the neighborhood, asking anyone who would listen, and looking for the black van the elderly woman had described. But the only result had been a series of distrustful looks and doors slammed in his face. Exhausted and frustrated, Logan stopped at a dark corner, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets as he tried to think of his next move. There was something deeply unsettling about all of this, and with each passing minute, the sense of urgency intensified. How dangerous could it be to keep looking? How far was he willing to go? Suddenly, he noticed a small group of homeless people gathered in a nearby alley. They were warming themselves around a burning metal barrel, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange flames. Logan hesitated. He knew it would be hard to gain the trust of people already used to being ignored or mistreated. But if anyone could have seen something, it would be people like them. He approached slowly, showing his open hands to appear less threatening. Noticing his presence, the figures turned towards him, their eyes glinting with suspicion. "What do you want?" growled one of them, an older man with a grey beard and skin hardened by the cold and the harshness of street life. "I just want to ask a few questions," Logan replied firmly, though he felt a slight tremor inside. He pulled out a €20 bill from his wallet and held it up in front of him. "I'm looking for a little boy, about 8 years old. His name is Parker. I saw him in this area last night, but I haven't been able to find him since." The bearded man squinted, eyeing the bill with wariness, but didn't look away from Logan. "And what makes you think we know anything?" he asked coldly. "I don't know," Logan admitted, lowering the bill. "But I know people like you tend to see things others don't. All I want is to find him. He's in danger." There was a tense silence. The old man's eyes flashed with something akin to pity for a brief moment before he looked away and shrugged. "There's a lot of people in danger around here. Kids like that. They come and go." Logan felt his chest tighten. He was about to leave when a woman's voice spoke from the other side of the burning barrel. "I know who you're talking about." Logan quickly turned toward the voice. It was a slender woman with bronze skin and dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She wore tattered clothes and looked at Logan with a disconcerting intensity. The others seemed to respect her, remaining silent as she stepped forward. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. "My name is Logan," he said. "I'm looking for a boy named Parker. Last night, he slipped a note into my pocket. It says he's being held captive." The woman raised an eyebrow as if assessing him carefully. Then, after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, she nodded. "I'm Isabel," she said calmly. "I help the street kids. Many of them disappear without a trace. Most don't come back. Do you know where he is?" Logan felt his heart race. Finally, he had found someone who seemed to know something. Isabel shook her head, but her eyes softened a little. "I don't know exactly where he is," she replied, "but I heard about him a couple of days ago. They say a group has been following him. They're traffickers, people who prey on children nobody misses." "Traffickers?" Logan repeated, a chill running down his spine. "Yes. They're not just kidnappers," Isabel whispered, as if afraid someone might hear. "They use them to beg for money, to steal, and if the kids resist or try to run, they disappear. I saw Parker a few days ago, hiding behind a dumpster. He looked terrified, like he knew they were looking for him. I tried to talk to him, but he ran away." Logan felt a mix of desperation and fury swirl inside him. "Do you know who's behind this?" he asked, leaning closer to her. Isabel looked at him with a mix of pity and warning. "There's someone who controls all of this. Everyone fears him. No one dares to speak about him. But I know someone who could give you more information. His name is Raul. He's a dangerous guy, but if you manage to talk to him, he might tell you more about Parker's whereabouts." "Where can I find Raul?" Isabel paused, as if still deciding whether to tell him the truth or not. Then, with a sigh, she pointed toward the end of the alley. "He goes to an underground bar on Rosales Avenue near the old bridge. You'll see him there after midnight, always surrounded by his men, but be careful. If he feels threatened, he won't hesitate to hurt you." Logan nodded slowly. Although the warning made him uneasy, he felt he was finally making progress. Raul was the only solid lead he had so far. "Thank you," he said, looking at Isabel sincerely. "Why are you helping me?" Isabel lowered her gaze, her expression turning somber. "Because no one helped my brother when he disappeared," she whispered, and before Logan could say anything else, She turned and vanished into the darkness of the alley. Logan stood there, heart pounding and mind racing with questions. He had to find Raul and learn what he knew about Parker. But now that he understood what he was up against, he realized this wasn't just a simple case of a missing child. He was wading into deep and dangerous waters. That night, as he made his way to Rosales Avenue, Logan couldn't stop wondering if he was truly prepared for what he might find. If Raul was really involved with a trafficking network, facing him alone would be like stepping into a lion's den. But he had no choice. Parker needed help, and if he didn't act, no one else would. He walked with determined steps, tension burning in his chest, and for the first time since all this began, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't going to give up. Somewhere in the city, Parker was still waiting to be found, and Logan wasn't going to let him down. The sound of cars driving over the old bridge echoed through the cold night air. Logan found himself on Rosales Avenue, a part of town known for its underground dealings and the shadowy characters that roamed its streets after dark. He eyed the bar Isabel had told him about. On the surface, it looked like just another rundown establishment, with dirty windows and a metal door barely illuminated by a flickering neon sign that read, El Silencio. He took a deep breath and crossed the street with determined steps, though every fiber of his being was tense. The area was full of hooded figures lurking in the shadows, and the atmosphere crackled with danger. Logan knew he had to play his cards right. If he made one wrong move, he could end up as just another casualty in the morning news. He pushed open the door of the bar, and the stench of tobacco and alcohol hit him immediately. The place was filled with people who seemed to shun curious eyes. Some card players huddled in a corner, a few rough-looking men leaned against the bar, and a red-haired woman watched him suspiciously from a secluded table. Low music played softly, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Carefully, Logan approached the bar. The bartender, a burly man with tattoo-covered arms, looked him up and down. "What do you want?" he growled. Logan leaned in a bit, keeping his voice as low as possible. "I'm looking for Raul. I need to speak with him," he said, trying to sound confident. The bartender raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. He glanced towards the back of the bar, where a group of men were playing cards. Among them, a man in a black leather jacket with a scar on his cheek was smoking a cigar, watching the game with the sharp focus of a predator. Raul. Logan felt a shiver run through him as he realized he was just a few meters away from the most dangerous person he had ever faced in his life. "Good luck with that," muttered the bartender, turning away. Logan swallowed hard and walked towards Raul. The men around him looked up as he approached, their gazes cold and calculating. The air grew even more tense. When he reached the table, Raul glanced up at him with a mocking smile. "Who the hell are you?" he asked in a deep voice, snuffing out his cigar in an overflowing ashtray. Logan forced himself to stand his ground. "I want to talk about a boy named Parker." The name dropped like a bomb. The murmurs stopped, and the air seemed to crackle with electricity. Raul narrowed his eyes, his smile vanishing instantly. "Who told you that name?" he whispered, leaning forward. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "I just want to find him. He left me a note. He's in danger, and I know you know where he is," Logan said, his voice as steady as he could make it. The men around him shifted uneasily. One of them set his drink down and stood, as if ready to pounce. But Raul raised a hand, stopping them. He looked at Logan with an expression that was a mix of surprise, curiosity, and menace. "A note, you say?" he asked slowly. "What did it say?" "It said he was being held captive, that he needed help," Logan replied. Raul let out a dry laugh, though his eyes didn't relax for a second. He stood and circled around Logan, studying him like a bug under a microscope. "And why do you think you could help him? What makes you think someone like you can get involved in these matters and walk away unscathed?" Logan kept his gaze steady, refusing to look away. "Because no one else will, and because I'm not going to let another child disappear," he said, his voice trembling slightly, but his eyes blazing with fierce determination. Raul stared at him for a long moment. Then he leaned in close, his breath hot and reeking of tobacco against Logan's face. "Listen, idiot, you have no idea what you're getting into. Parker isn't just another kid. He's one of many. And the people behind this, they're much bigger than you could ever imagine." Logan felt a knot form in his stomach. Something in Raul's tone told him he wasn't lying. "Then tell me where he is," he insisted. "Where are they keeping him?" Raul shook his head with a cruel smile. "I can't tell you that, but I know someone who can give you more answers, if you survive the meeting." Logan held his ground, though his heart was hammering in his chest. "Who?" "Her name is Rachel," Raul said with a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "She's a social worker, sticks her nose where it doesn't belong and is obsessed with these kids. She asks questions, sometimes too many questions." Raul shrugged and returned to his seat. "She'll tell you what you need to know, if she's willing to talk to you. You can find her tomorrow morning at the community center on Gomez Street. But I warn you, if you keep getting involved, you better pack your bags and get ready for a long stay in hell." Logan didn't reply. He turned and walked out of the bar, feeling the men's eyes boring into his back until the door swung shut behind him. Outside, the cold air gave him a slight sense of relief. Rachel, a social worker, someone who might help him put the missing pieces together. The next morning, Logan arrived early at the community center on Gomez Street. The building was modest, with worn-out walls and a barely visible sign at the entrance. There were a few people waiting outside, mothers with small children, elderly folks, and a couple of teenagers who looked just as lost as he felt. He entered and asked for Rachel. A receptionist eyed him up and down, clearly unsure whether to let him in or not. "Why are you looking for Rachel?" she asked suspiciously. "It's about the kids," Logan said, showing Parker's note. "Please, I need to speak with her." The woman frowned and stood slowly. "Wait here." Logan waited, watching as people came and went through the center. A few minutes later, the receptionist returned with a tall woman, her brown hair tied back in a bun and dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people noticed. She was dressed simply, in a brown jacket and jeans, but there was something about her presence that commanded respect. "I'm Rachel Vargas," she said, crossing her arms. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Logan handed her the note, quickly telling her his story. Rachel read it carefully, and then looked up, scrutinizing him with distrust. "Why do you care so much about this kid?" she asked coldly. "You could have just turned around and forgotten about him like everyone else does." Logan looked directly into her eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be unable to help someone you love. And I don't want another child to go through that, if I can do something to stop it." For a moment, Rachel said nothing. Then she sighed and nodded slowly. "All right, Logan. But if we're going to move forward, you need to know that what you're about to uncover could destroy you," she said, her tone as grim as her eyes. "Because the people behind all this, they won't stop at anything to protect their secrets." And just like that, unwillingly, Logan crossed a threshold he could never return from. He had found the only person who could help him uncover the truth. But deep down, he knew he was about to step into an abyss that might leave him shattered. Rachel's small office was filled with boxes of files and scattered papers everywhere. The air smelled of dust and stale coffee, and the walls were covered with posters about children's rights and social aid. However, what truly caught Logan's attention was the large corkboard covering one of the walls, full of photographs, maps, and notes connected with red strings, forming a chaotic spiderweb. Logan approached it slowly, feeling as if every photo was staring back at him with a mix of sadness and desperation. Most of them were of children timidly smiling at the camera, some with visible signs of abuse, others with vacant eyes. The pictures were surrounded by newspaper clippings, names and dates written in red ink, and arrows linking specific points of the city. It was a maze of information that reflected the chaos and complexity of the situation. "This Logan ran a hand through his hair, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was seeing. Is all of this about missing children? Rachel, standing beside him, nodded with a grim expression on her face. Yes. Every one of these cases is a child who disappeared under suspicious circumstances in the past 3 years, she said, pointing to some of the older photos. The authorities consider them runaways or troubled kids who left home. But that's not true. Logan leaned in closer, focusing on a group of photographs in the lower corner of the board. There were several young faces, all resembling Parker, boys between 6 and 12 years old, mostly from broken families, some orphans, others with parents in jail. What happened to them? He asked quietly. Rachel took one of the photographs and held it up in front of him. It was an image of a small girl with dark hair and large, sad eyes. She was wearing a pink dress, but her face showed signs of recent tears. "This is Sofia Garcia," she said, her voice heavy with contained pain. "She disappeared 2 years ago from a shelter. No one has seen her since. They labeled her a runaway, but I know that's not true. She was happy here, she was getting better. Then one night she just vanished." Logan swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. Sophia's story reminded him of Parker in a deeply unsettling way. "Do you think the trafficking ring is behind this?" Rachel placed Sophia's picture back in its place and turned toward him. "I don't think. I know," she said firmly. "I've been tracking these cases for years. They always follow the same pattern. Children like Parker, Sophia, and many others disappear in specific areas. There's always someone new involved, a recruiter who shows up to take away the kids no one else wants. And the children who are difficult or try to escape, they just vanish." Logan felt a mix of rage and despair building up inside him. "Recruiter?" he repeated. "Who is he?" Rachel narrowed her eyes at him as if gauging whether she could trust him. Finally, she walked over to her desk and picked up a stained, worn-out folder. She opened it and showed him a blurry, indistinct photograph of a man. "They call him the Hunter," Rachel said softly. "No one knows his real name. He's the one who selects the children and moves them to different locations in the city. The obedient ones are taken to safe houses where they are trained and prepared to be sold or sent elsewhere. The ones who resist or try to run away," she paused, her expression turning grim, "are never heard from again." Logan felt his heart racing. "And you think Parker is in one of those safe houses?" Rachel nodded slowly. "Most likely, but the houses change locations constantly. They move them around to make sure they're never in one place for too long. They treat them like merchandise, ensuring no one can trace them." Logan's stomach churned at the harshness of those words. Like merchandise. These weren't just missing kids, these were shattered lives, human beings treated as objects to fulfill the desires of sick people. "But if no one knows where these houses are, how are we going to find Parker?" he asked, frustration lacing his voice. Rachel turned back to the board and pointed to a map of the city. There were several areas marked with red circles, most of them in dangerous neighborhoods and dark alleys. "This is the network of locations I've identified so far," she explained. "I don't have the exact location of the current houses, but I know there's a pattern. They always use abandoned properties or dilapidated buildings. Here," she pointed to a large circle in the southern part of the city, "this is where we saw activity last time. I think one of their contact points might be in this area." Logan studied the place she was indicating. It was a dangerous neighborhood, full of empty warehouses and industrial buildings that no one looked at twice. "So, what do we do now?" he asked, his mind racing. Rachel pressed her lips together as if making a decision. "I know someone who works inside the child protection system," she said finally. "She might have access to more information, but we need to move carefully. If anyone suspects what we're doing, this whole operation could fall apart, and Parker would disappear forever." Logan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go find her." A few hours later, they met in a cafe at a community center. The woman they were waiting for finally arrived. She was short, with graying hair tied in a bun, and dressed simply, as if trying to blend in. Paula Mendez, the director of a child protection program, greeted Rachel with a brief hug, and Logan with a wary look. "Rachel told me you have information about a missing child," she said quietly, watching Logan with sharp eyes. "Yes, his name is Parker. I saw him a few days ago, and he left a note asking for help." "Rachel thinks he's trapped in a child trafficking ring," Logan said quickly. Paula remained silent, biting her lower lip. Then she leaned closer to them. "There's something very dark within the system," she murmured, barely moving her lips. "Someone's collaborating from the inside. I've seen files disappear, children who shouldn't be on certain lists. One name keeps showing up: Victor Roberts." "Victor Roberts?" Logan repeated. "The businessman?" Paula nodded gravely. "He has connections with powerful people within the protection system. I believe he uses his influence to divert children, hide records, and ensure no one asks questions. He is the real boss behind the network." Rachel closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh. "I knew there was someone big behind all this. But Roberts," she whispered incredulously. Logan felt his entire body tense up. If Roberts was involved, it meant they were up against someone with resources and connections at every level. "So, how do we get to him?" he asked firmly. Paula took a piece of paper out of her coat pocket and handed it to him. It was an address. "This is the last location they used to hide some children," she explained. "I can't promise that Parker is there, but if you find him, you might have the first piece of the puzzle to track down Roberts." Logan looked at the address and then back at the two women. "I'm going. I need to find Parker," he said, his voice unwavering. Rachel looked at him with something like a tired smile on her lips. "Then you're not alone," she replied. "We'll go together. We can't face this separately." Paula watched them, concern etched on her face. "Be careful," she whispered. "Roberts doesn't play fair." Logan stared intently at the address Paula had given them. The location was in an abandoned area on the outskirts of the city, an old warehouse that was rumored to have been a mechanic's workshop in better times. Rachel, sitting beside him in the old sedan he'd borrowed from a friend, reviewed her notes over and over again, searching for any additional clues they could use. "If Parker is there, we can't just barge in without a plan," Rachel said quietly, frowning. "If Roberts controls these places, we have to assume they're being watched. If they see us coming, they might move the children before we can do anything." Logan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark warehouse in front of them. There were few lights in the area, and the surrounding buildings were empty concrete structures with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. "So, what do you suggest?" Logan asked. "We need help to get in without drawing attention. And the only way to do that is with someone who has the authority to intervene," Rachel responded, biting her lower lip nervously. "We need to contact an officer who isn't involved in the network, someone we can trust to back us up." Logan thought quickly. The last time he'd tried to go to the police, he'd been ignored. But this time, he wasn't alone. Rachel knew people in the system, and together they had more evidence than he'd ever thought possible to gather. "Who do you have in mind?" Logan asked. Rachel pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. Finally, she stopped on a number. "Thomas Guevara, an officer from the Special Investigations Department. I've worked with him on a couple of cases before. He's one of the few I still trust." Logan watched her as she dialed the number. As she waited for Thomas to pick up, a bad feeling began to build in his chest. Rachel had said the system was corrupted to the core. What if this officer was compromised too? But before he could voice his doubts, Rachel was already speaking with Thomas. "Thomas, it's Rachel. I need your help," she said urgently. "I've found a safe house where I think several children are being held. I can't go in without support." There was a pause on the line, and then a deep voice, slightly surprised, replied, "Where are you?" Rachel gave him the address, and after a brief exchange, hung up. "He'll meet us in 20 minutes, she said, putting her phone away. "He says he'll bring a couple of trusted officers." Logan nodded, though he didn't feel relieved. A lingering unease remained in his chest. While they waited, he decided to scout the perimeter of the warehouse, looking for entry points or anything that seemed suspicious. There was a rusty gate at the back and several boarded-up windows. The area was deserted, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. 20 minutes later, the headlights of a police car cut through the darkness of the street. Logan and Rachel approached the vehicle, and a tall man with dark hair and a long grey coat stepped out of the driver's seat. It was Thomas. Beside him, a younger officer with a spotless uniform accompanied him. "Rachel, Logan." Thomas greeted them seriously, shaking each of their hands. "Tell me everything you know." Rachel explained what they had uncovered about Roberts's network and Parker's whereabouts. Thomas listened silently, his face unreadable. "We need to go in quietly," Rachel said finally. "If those inside suspect we're coming, they'll move the children before we can act." Thomas nodded slowly. "We can do that. But first, I need to know what evidence you have. If we're going to move forward with this, I need to be sure it's not a waste of time," he said, his tone calm but firm. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then took out her phone. She showed him some of the photos and documents she had gathered, including reports of missing children and the pattern she had painstakingly traced. Thomas looked at them with interest, but Logan felt something was off. There was something in the way Thomas remained too calm. "This is enough to justify a raid," Thomas finally said, handing the phone back to Rachel. "But it'll just be us. I can't involve anyone else from the department without risking Roberts finding out." Rachel seemed satisfied with the response, but Logan stayed tense. "So, we're going in now?" Logan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas looked at him steadily, and for a moment, Logan thought he saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt? Remorse? Before he could process it, Thomas turned to his partner and nodded. "Yes, we're going in now." They approached the warehouse silently. Thomas and his partner led, with Rachel and Logan a few steps behind. They reached the building's back door, and the younger officer pulled a small pry bar from his belt to force the rusty lock. The click of the lock breaking echoed softly in the darkness. "Stay behind us," Thomas ordered quietly. They entered in silence. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, barely illuminated by the faint light seeping through the boarded windows. They moved through empty hallways, their footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. But as they advanced, Logan felt the tension rising. Something was wrong. There were no guards, no sound of children. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway burst open, and before they could react, a group of armed men appeared, blocking their way. Logan froze. How did they know they were coming? Thomas raised his hands calmly. "Relax, it's me," he said. The men lowered their weapons, and Thomas turned to Logan and Rachel with an expression of regret. "I'm sorry, Rachel, but I can't let you continue." Rachel took a step back, her eyes filling with horror. What are you doing, Thomas?" "You're playing with fire," Thomas said coldly. "And I can't risk my career or my life for a lost cause. These children don't matter anymore. No one is going to save them." Logan felt rage boiling up inside him. They had been betrayed. "You're with them," Logan shouted, taking a step forward, but one of the men raised his gun. "No," Thomas said slowly. "I'm not with them, but I can't afford to be against them." He looked at Logan with cold eyes. "You have no idea what you're getting into. Roberts has contacts at every level. This isn't just a group of criminals. It's an organization backed by very powerful people. If you keep going, you'll die." Rachel stared at him, a mix of pain and betrayal on her face. "And you're going to hand us over?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm just going to give you a warning," he replied. "Leave this place and disappear. Forget about Parker and the others. If you get involved again, there'll be no one to protect you. This is your last chance." Logan looked at Rachel, her eyes filled with tears of rage. The room was completely silent except for their ragged breathing. "We're not stopping," Logan said in a low, firm voice. "I'm not leaving Parker in the hands of monsters." Thomas sighed, looking down. "I knew you'd say that." With a sharp gesture, he signaled to the armed men. "Take them away. Leave them somewhere far off." The men moved quickly, and before they could react, they were struck with the butts of their guns. Darkness enveloped Logan, and the last thing he heard was Thomas murmuring, "I'm sorry. I truly am." And then everything went black. Logan regained consciousness slowly, the throbbing pain in his head being the first thing he felt. Everything was blurry and confusing, as if his mind was struggling to piece together reality. He blinked several times, trying to focus his vision, but the dark surroundings and the cold air on his skin made him shiver. Where was he? The metallic taste of blood on his lips reminded him of the blow, and he sat up with a gasp of pain. He was tied to a chair, his wrists bound tightly with plastic zip ties that dug into his skin. The room was small and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. It seemed like some kind of storage room or warehouse, with peeling walls and the air heavy with dampness. A faint moan to his right made him turn his head, and his heart sank when he saw Rachel beside him, also bound to a chair and still unconscious. "Rachel," he whispered, forcing his dry, raspy voice to speak. He leaned towards her, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. He had taken a heavy hit, and every movement sent a wave of agony through his body. "Rachel, wake up." She groaned softly, her head moving slightly as her eyes finally fluttered open. At first she seemed disoriented, but when she recognized him, her expression shifted to a mix of relief and terror. "What? Where are we?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I don't know," Logan replied, struggling to free his hands. "It was a setup. Thomas, he's with them." Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to contain a surge of emotions. When she opened them again, they were filled with a fury that seemed to burn from within. "I knew there was a risk of betrayal, but I never thought it would be him," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "I worked with him for years. I thought we could trust him." Logan tugged at his wrists harder, feeling the plastic biting into his skin. Desperation pounded in his chest. He knew that if they were still alive, it was only because Roberts didn't want them dead. At least not yet. "We need to get out of here," Logan said hoarsely. "If they're leaving us alone for too long, it means they're planning something." Rachel nodded, swallowing with difficulty. "We have to find a way to break these ties. If I can reach that toolbox over there," she said, nodding towards a shelf a few meters away, where a pair of old pliers sat among piles of rusted junk. Logan glanced at her. He could reach it, but it would take time and stealth. Moving cautiously, he began sliding his chair inch by inch towards the shelf, the sound of the wood scraping against the concrete echoing faintly in the room. Every centimeter felt like an eternity. Just as his hand was almost touching the pliers, the door to the room burst open, making them both freeze. "Well, well, I see you're finally awake." Victor Roberts' voice was smooth, almost polite, but the chilling tone beneath his words made Logan's heart skip a beat. Roberts strode into the room, flanked by two burly men with guns visible on their belts. He wore an impeccable suit, his shoes shined to perfection, and the malicious gleam in his dark eyes showed he was thoroughly enjoying the situation. "Logan Bennett and Rachel Vargas," he said, savoring their names as if he was speaking of old friends. "I wonder what you were thinking when you decided to play heroes." Logan glared at him, struggling to keep his composure. "Where's Parker?" he demanded, not bothering to hide his anger. Roberts smiled, showing his perfectly aligned teeth. He walked slowly towards Rachel, stopping just inches from her. "That's not something you need to worry about, my friend," he said, his tone almost condescending. "Parker is just one child among many, and you two," he leaned closer to Rachel, tilting his head, "are just a couple of annoying amateurs who stepped into a world that doesn't belong to you." "We're not going to stop," Rachel growled, meeting his gaze with blazing eyes. "We'll find Parker and everyone else, and when we do, you and your entire network will fall." Roberts's laugh was low and bitter. "Do you really believe that, dear?" he murmured, leaning even closer. "This system is rotten to the core. I'm not the monster here. I'm just a facilitator. I provide people with what they want. And there are many, many men and women in power who want what I offer." Logan felt a wave of nausea. Every word Roberts spoke was like a dagger. He wasn't just a criminal. He was someone who saw himself as untouchable, as if the entire system was built to protect him. "That won't last forever," Logan said firmly. "Things change. People like you always make mistakes." Roberts turned slowly to face him, the smile fading from his face. "Is that what you think?" he asked softly. "Do you think I haven't anticipated your every move?" He extended a hand, and one of the men handed him a small device. It was a phone. "Look at this." Logan squinted. The screen showed a live video. It was a park. Children were playing, but one of them, his heart stopped. Lucia. His little Lucia was playing with the other children, completely unaware of what was happening. The video was blurry, but it was clearly recorded from a close distance. The camera zoomed in on her, focusing on her innocent face as she laughed and swung on the swings. "No!" Logan gasped, struggling to rise, but the zip ties held him down. "Yes," Roberts said softly, his voice dripping with venom. "I could make your daughter disappear in minutes. So listen to me carefully, Logan. Stop looking. Stop meddling where you don't belong. If you try to stop me again, the next thing you'll see is your daughter being thrown into the back of one of my trucks, heading to a place where you'll never find her." Logan's soul shattered into 1,000 pieces. Fury, fear, and helplessness swirled inside him. He tried to break free again, shouting in frustration, but Roberts just watched him with a mocking expression. "You can't win, but you can do something smart for once in your life," Roberts continued, tossing the phone onto the table. "Take this as a warning. Let it go, leave the city, and disappear. Take your daughter and start over somewhere else. It's the only chance you have." Logan remained silent, his chest heaving with rage and fear. His eyes met Rachel's. She was pale too, her hands trembling. But when she looked at him, he saw the same resolve in her eyes that burned in his own heart. "Go to hell," Logan growled through clenched teeth, staring straight at Roberts. Roberts's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "Then I guess I'll have to do things my way." With a swift motion, he turned to one of his men. "Take them to the forest. Tie them up tight and make sure they can't call for help for a while. Let them suffer, but let them live." He glanced back at Logan one last time. "I want you to remember this moment the next time you think about challenging me." And with that, Roberts walked out of the room, leaving Logan and Rachel with their captors. "You won't get away with this," Rachel shouted, struggling against her restraints in vain. "We won't stop." But the men said nothing. They just knocked them out again, and darkness swallowed them once more. Logan faded away to the sound of his own labored breathing, and the image of Lucia etched into his mind. A silent promise burned in his chest. The cold was biting when Logan regained consciousness a second time. The darkness around him was nearly absolute, and the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath his body. The wind whistled through the trees, making the bare branches sway like ghostly hands in the gloom. He blinked, trying to clear the haze from his mind. The pain in his head was sharper this time, as if they had struck him intending to kill him. He sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his body and the sharp ache in his ribs. The ties that had bound his wrists were now cut, and the deep marks they left burned like smoldering coals. "Rachel," he murmured, desperately turning to one side. She was a few meters away, her body lying motionless on the fallen leaves. Relief washed over him as he saw her breathing, though unevenly. He dragged himself over to her, ignoring the pain in his limbs, and gently shook her. "Rachel, wake up. Come on, you have to wake up." She stirred, groaning in pain as she opened her eyes with difficulty. When her gaze focused on him, alarm filled her pupils. Where are we?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Logan looked around. The night's darkness barely revealed the outlines of the tall, twisted trees surrounding them. They were in some kind of forest, but there wasn't a single sign of civilization nearby. The only traces of human presence were the tire tracks on the ground and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. "They left us in the middle of nowhere," Logan said, his voice low. "They want us dead, but not here. They want us to suffer, just like Robert said." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, fighting to suppress the despair. But when she looked at him again, there was fire in her eyes. "I won't let that bastard win. If they think they can break us, they're dead wrong." Logan nodded. He rose to his feet slowly, helping her up as well. They both staggered, but they couldn't afford to weaken. They had to find a way out of there and keep going, because now, more than ever, they knew there was no turning back. Roberts had threatened the most sacred thing in Logan's life, his daughter, and if that monster even dared to go near her. "We have to keep moving," Logan murmured, his voice hoarse with hatred and determination. "For Lucia, for Parker, for all those children." Rachel looked at him, her jaw clenched. She nodded, and they both started moving. They walked for what seemed like hours through the forest, each step slow and painful. The night was freezing, and their injured bodies shivered from the cold. Yet, the determination to find a way out kept them going, even though every crunch beneath their feet reminded them how fragile they were. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a clearing and saw lights in the distance. Logan squinted, trying to identify their source. It wasn't a city or a town, just an old house with a flickering light on the porch. It looked abandoned, but it was the only structure for miles around. "Do you think we should take the risk?" Rachel asked softly. Logan hesitated. It could be another trap. Roberts wouldn't leave things to chance, but in their condition and with darkness surrounding them, they didn't have many options. "We can't stay in the forest," Logan whispered finally. "If we don't find shelter, the cold will kill us before the sun comes up." Rachel nodded, and they cautiously moved toward the house. The wooden structure creaked with every gust of wind, and the windows were boarded up haphazardly. But the most unsettling thing was the absolute silence. Not a single sound came from inside, not even animals or insects. When they reached the porch, Rachel raised a trembling hand and knocked softly on the door. There was no response. Logan exchanged a glance with her, then pushed the door slowly. To his surprise, it opened with a long, mournful creak. "I don't like this," Rachel whispered, peering into the darkness inside. "Neither do I," Logan admitted, "but we don't have any other choice." They entered slowly, scanning every corner. The inside was filled with dust and cobwebs, as if no one had lived there for years. Yet, something felt off. There was a faint smell of tobacco in the air, and the wooden floor looked more worn than it should. "This place isn't abandoned," Rachel murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Logan nodded, and as he turned to respond, the door behind them slammed shut. "What the hell?" The sound of a lock clicking echoed through the empty house, and suddenly, bright lights flashed on, blinding them. Logan raised his hands to shield his eyes as the hum of a generator filled the air. When he could finally see, horror hit him like a punch to the gut. There were cameras. 3, 4, 5 cameras mounted in the corners of the room, all pointed at them. In the center of the room was a metal chair and a table with a single object on it, a screen connected to the cameras. "What is this?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking with panic. Before Logan could respond, the screen flickered and turned on. The image that appeared made his heart stop. It was a live feed of Lucia. The little girl was in her bedroom, playing with her toys, completely unaware of the danger lurking. A tall, thin man, his face hidden by a black mask, stood in the corner of the room, silently watching her. "No," Logan gasped, feeling despair tighten its grip on him. The man on the screen raised his hand slowly and waved his fingers at the camera, as if he knew they were watching. Then he pulled a small knife from his belt and lifted it, letting the blade glint under the room's light. "Sit down," a deep voice commanded from somewhere in the house. It echoed through a hidden speaker, cold and mocking. "If you don't want this little girl to have an accident, you're going to stay very, very still and listen." Logan felt tears burning his eyes. Rachel clasped her hands over her mouth, horrified. "What do you want?" Logan roared into the emptiness. "I want you to understand that there's no escape," the voice said, slow and deliberate. "It doesn't matter how hard you try, how many safe houses you find, how many children you rescue. There will always be more, and we will always be one step ahead." The man on the screen lowered the knife slowly and pointed it at Lucia, who continued to play, blissfully unaware of what was happening. "You have one last chance, Logan. You're going to forget about Parker. You're going to forget everything you've seen, and you'll take your daughter far away. Because if you don't, the next time you see this video, she won't be playing. Understand?" Logan was trembling, every fiber of his being screaming to do something, anything, to save his daughter. "I understand," he murmured finally, his voice breaking. "I understand." "Good boy," the voice purred. "Now, leave the house, and remember, I'm always watching." The cameras shut off, the screen went black. The door behind them creaked open slowly. Logan and Rachel stood there, the terror still hanging over them like a dark cloud. But something else burned in Logan's chest, a cold and deadly fury. He wasn't going to give up, but now he knew he had to play smarter than ever. "This isn't over," Rachel whispered, her eyes fixed on the open door. "It's only just begun." Logan nodded, his jaw clenched. "We're going to destroy them, but first, we need to make sure Lucia is safe." "Do you think we're far from the city?" Rachel asked, rubbing her sore wrists. Logan glanced around. The forest was dense and dark, and there was no clear path in sight. It was as if they'd been dropped in the middle of nowhere. "I don't know," he said, standing up with effort. "But we have to move. If we stay here, they might come back to make sure we don't survive." Rachel nodded with a clenched jaw, and they started walking, stumbling blindly over roots and uneven ground. Each step was a painful effort, but adrenaline and the urgency to escape kept them going. They pushed through the undergrowth, fighting against the branches that scratched their legs and arms, until they finally spotted a road in the distance. "There!" Rachel gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. They quickened their pace, staggering with exhaustion and pain, until they reached the edge of the road. They were covered in mud and leaves, but they didn't stop. They looked both ways, and with a sigh of relief, saw the lights of a vehicle approaching in the distance. "We have to make it stop," Logan said, stepping into the middle of the road and raising his hands. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and an older man, wearing a trucker's cap and a bewildered expression, rolled down the window. "What the hell happened to you two?" he asked, staring at their wounds and disheveled appearance in disbelief. "We were kidnapped," Rachel said quickly. "We need to get to the city and alert someone." The man blinked a couple of times, then slowly nodded. "Get in. I'll take you to the nearest police station." Logan exchanged a look with Rachel. The station wasn't the safest place, especially if Thomas and others were involved, but it was their only option for now. They nodded, climbed into the back of the truck, and collapsed into the seats, trying to catch their breath. The station they arrived at was on the outskirts of town, a small outpost with only 2 officers on duty. Logan and Rachel entered quickly, eyes alert. But when they started explaining what had happened, They noticed the officers looked at them with disbelief. "So, a guy named Victor Roberts kidnapped you and left you in the woods?" one of the officers asked, obvious skepticism in his tone. "That sounds like something out of a movie." Logan clenched his fists, struggling to stay calm. "We need to speak with someone at Central Headquarters," he said firmly. "We're in danger, and if you don't listen, more people will die." The officer sighed, glancing at his partner, who shrugged indifferently. "Fine, wait here. I'll make a call." As they waited, the silence between them was heavy. Logan looked at Rachel, who seemed lost in thought. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded slowly, but there was something in her eyes that unsettled him. "I don't know who to trust," she whispered. "I thought we knew who we could count on. But if Thomas betrayed us, who else is involved?" Before Logan could respond, the officer returned, a serious expression on his face. "I spoke with the captain. They're sending someone to escort you to a safe place," he said. "But it might take a couple of hours. Do you want to sit while you wait?" Logan nodded, but as they turned to head for the chairs, a flash of light outside made him freeze. Outside, in the darkness, a black truck pulled up in front of the station. Panic coursed through him like an electric shock. "No!" he gasped, grabbing Rachel. "We have to get out of here." "What? What's happening?" Rachel asked, startled. Logan shoved her toward the back door just as two men stepped out of the truck, their shadows looming against the station walls. "They found us," he whispered in horror. "Rachel, we have to run." Rachel understood immediately. Without looking back, they burst through the back door, running into the dark alley as the men moved toward the building. The sound of the officers' shouts echoed behind them, but they didn't stop. Logan grabbed Rachel's hand and they ran blindly, plunging into the empty streets, fear and adrenaline pushing them forward. Now they knew the truth. They were completely alone. And Roberts's network wouldn't stop until both of them were either dead or vanished. After running like mad, they made it to the darkness of the forest, where they would stay hidden all night, thinking of a plan. The next day, with the morning sun, they emerged onto the road again, hoping to get a ride from a passing driver who gave them a lift to the city. Once in the city, they stayed low for 4 days, recovering, healing their wounds, eating, and carefully plotting their next move to confront the kidnappers. Planning was essential if they wanted to make it out alive. The day of reckoning arrived. They packed their things, managed to get a car, and set off on the mission of their lives, filled with hope and determination. The icy wind sliced through their skin like blades as the old sedan sped down the highway. Logan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white from the strain. Beside him, Rachel checked the magazine of the gun they had managed to get from one of their few trustworthy contacts. There was no turning back. They had gathered a small group of people willing to risk everything, but they knew that, even with all the help, this operation was a suicide mission. The farm wasn't just any hideout. According to the information they had gathered, it was the place where Roberts's network trained and prepared children before selling them or shipping them abroad. It was a distribution hub, and probably the last chance they had to save Parker and many others. If they failed, Roberts would dismantle everything, relocate them, and erase all traces. "Do you think we're ready for this?" Logan finally asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Rachel admitted in a rough voice, "but we have no choice. This is our only shot to gain the upper hand. If we can gather solid evidence and catch the people involved in the sale, we might expose the whole network." "And if we fail?" Logan couldn't help but ask. Rachel pressed her lips together, her gaze hardening. "We can't fail, Logan. If we do, all those missing children will be swallowed by the darkness forever." Logan nodded, feeling a mix of fear and adrenaline swirl inside him. They couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not after everything they had sacrificed to reach this point. The house stood in the middle of a wasteland, surrounded by tall trees and concrete walls covered in graffiti. From a distance, it looked like another abandoned building, forgotten by the city. But as they got closer, Logan noticed something that made his hair stand on end. A faint light flickering in one of the second-floor windows and the occasional flash of security lanterns. There were guards. "There it is," Rachel whispered, parking the car at a safe distance and turning off the lights. "We'll approach on foot." Logan nodded, and they both stepped out of the car, moving quietly among the trees. As they got closer, they could see more clearly. Several armed men stood at the main entrance, dressed in black and communicating through radios. Inside, shadows moved behind dirty windows. "It looks like they're expecting someone," Logan murmured. "It might be Roberts," he added. Rachel shook her head, eyes narrowed. "I don't think so. If he were here, there'd be more security. It must be one of his intermediaries, organizing the sale. But if we catch this person, we could get to Roberts." "So, what do we do now?" Logan asked, his pulse quickening. "First, we need to get inside and find out how many kids are there. Once they're safe, we can take care of the rest," Rachel said, pulling a small package from her bag and handing it to Logan. "Put this on." Logan opened the package and found a tiny microphone and a small earpiece. Rachel helped him put it on, then turned on her own device. "This way, we can stay in touch if we get separated," she explained. "Ready?" Logan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision they were about to make. But there was no turning back. "Ready." They moved like shadows around the perimeter, staying out of sight of the guards. Rachel found a weak spot in the fence surrounding the house and, with precise movements, opened a small hole for them to slip through. They hugged the walls, staying out of the lantern's reach until they reached a barely visible side entrance. Logan paused, listening carefully. There were no sounds inside, but the hum of security cameras told him they couldn't let their guard down. "We need to disable them," Rachel whispered, pointing to a junction box on the outer wall. Logan nodded and took out the wire cutter Isabel had given him before she died. He cut the cables precisely, and the red light on the cameras went out instantly. "Well done," Rachel said, and they slipped through the back door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the stale smell of mold and something more sinister. The house was a maze of empty rooms and narrow hallways, the floors covered in dust and debris. They moved silently, their footsteps barely a whisper in the oppressive silence. Finally, they reached a staircase leading to the basement. Voices drifted up from below. Rachel raised a hand to stop Logan and leaned slightly to listen. "Are the children ready?" asked a deep, rough voice. "Yes, they're all in the prep room. The buyers will arrive in half an hour," another voice replied. Logan felt his pulse quicken. They had very little time. "We have to move now," Rachel whispered, her face tense. They descended the stairs carefully and peeked down the hallway leading to the prep room. The sight froze their blood. There were at least a dozen children, all sitting on the floor, their eyes hollow and faces marked by fear. They huddled in a corner, watched by two armed men who chatted idly. "You stay here and cover the entrance," Rachel ordered, her tone firm. "I'll go in and get them out quietly." Logan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. His whole body trembled, but his mind was clear. He took position at the corner of the hallway, his eyes locked on the guards. Rachel slipped into the prep room, moving swiftly. She crouched down to their level, putting a finger to her lips to signal silence. One by one, the children began to move, their small, trembling figures following Rachel quietly. "Come on, little ones, let's go," she whispered softly. But then, a noise behind Logan made him whirl around. A guard appeared at the end of the hallway, his flashlight shining directly on Logan's face. "Hey!" the man shouted, raising his weapon. "Rachel, now!" Logan roared, throwing himself at the guard. Gunfire erupted in the basement as Logan tackled the man with all his strength, knocking him to the ground. He felt the burn of a bullet grazing his arm, but didn't stop. He hit the guard with his fist over and over until the man stopped moving. Rachel shouted something, but the roar of gunfire drowned everything out. The other guards had reacted, and chaos broke loose in the small room. Logan barely had time to stand before the first guard fired toward the entrance. "Get down!" he shouted, rolling across the floor to dodge the bullets. Rachel pushed the children toward the door, moving with desperate speed. But then, a man taller than the others appeared in the doorway, blocking their exit. His face was hidden by a mask, but the gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, raising his gun and pointing it directly at Rachel. Without thinking, Logan charged forward, lunging like a furious bull. The impact sent both of them crashing to the ground as bullets whizzed around them. He felt the punches in his ribs, pain shooting through every bone. But it didn't matter. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it with all his strength. The guard screamed and dropped the gun. Logan, gasping, grabbed it and, without thinking, fired twice. The man fell to the ground, lifeless. Silence fell over the room. "Logan!" Rachel shouted, running toward him with the children clinging to her legs. "We have to go now!" Logan staggered to his feet, feeling the warm blood trickling down his arm, but he didn't stop. He grabbed the hand of a small child and nodded. "Let's go. We can't stop. Follow me." The abandoned warehouse where they had uncovered the farm was engulfed in chaos. The lights flickered, and the shouts of Roberts's men echoed like ghostly reverberations through the dark, maze-like hallways. The sound of gunfire, the clatter of hurried boots, and the thud of bodies hitting the ground formed a chaotic symphony, filling the air with almost tangible tension. Logan and Rachel moved swiftly, cutting through the confusion as the volunteer team they had gathered fought against the remaining guards. "This way!" Rachel shouted, shoving open a rusty metal door that creaked loudly. Logan followed, his heart racing wildly. They knew Roberts had escaped, but their priority now was to ensure no child was transported out. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else. The corridors were packed with supply crates and old machines covered in dust, turning each corner into a potential hiding spot for more armed men. Each time they turned, Logan felt his body tense, bracing for the next confrontation. They advanced through a long corridor, the walls peeling and covered in graffiti that reflected years of neglect. Just as they were about to cross into a large storage room, a group of men emerged from the shadows, raising their weapons. "Back off," one of them barked, aiming a rifle at them. Logan didn't hesitate. He threw himself to the side, pushing Rachel out of the line of fire while drawing the revolver he had taken from a fallen guard. He dove behind a stack of metal crates just as shots rang out. Bullets whizzed past, sparking against the metal and sending shards flying. "Logan!" Rachel shouted from her position, trying to peek without exposing herself. "I'm fine," he called back, firing blindly around the crates to buy time. "We need to flank them." Rachel nodded, crawling quickly to the left, staying low as bullets ricocheted around her. From her vantage point, she saw the guards regrouping, firing accurately to keep them pinned. They couldn't stay there for long. If they didn't break through soon, they'd be overrun. Logan let out a shaky breath and took a deep breath. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, to push forward. With a fierce yell, he jumped up and fired twice. One guard fell, and the other stepped back, startled. Taking advantage of the confusion, Rachel sprang up and dashed through a side door that led to a small room filled with ventilation ducts and metal shelves. "Quick!" Logan panted, slamming the door shut behind them. They knew they didn't have much time before the guards caught up, but they needed to catch their breath and assess the situation. Rachel quickly reviewed the map she had memorized before the raid. "We're close to the loading area," she said, breathing heavily. "If Roberts is moving the children, it'll be through there. It's the only exit big enough for a convoy." "Good," Logan replied through gritted teeth. "We're stopping him, once and for all." They left the room and moved quickly through the secondary corridors, listening to the shouts and chaos erupting in the main warehouse. The farm was much larger than they had anticipated, with multiple interconnected sections and a complex security system they only now fully understood. Each door they passed brought them closer to the heart of Roberts's operation. Finally, they reached the loading area. The place was a massive hangar with high ceilings and several industrial lights flickering intermittently. 3 large trucks were lined up, their engines roaring ominously, a grim prelude to what was about to happen. Dozens of children, some with their hands bound and others huddled together, were being herded into the vehicles by a group of armed men. The children were crying and whimpering as the guards shoved them with shouts and curses. "Those bastards!" Logan growled, gripping the revolver so tightly his knuckles turned white. Rachel grabbed his arm. "There's too many," she whispered urgently. "If we go in head-on, they'll kill us all, and the children will be trapped." Logan closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the rage boiling inside him. She was right. But they couldn't just stand there and do nothing. "We need a distraction," he murmured, scanning the area desperately. Then he saw it. In the corner of the hangar, a stack of metal containers, one of them marked with large, flammable material warning symbols. "Is that—" "Yes," Rachel nodded, eyes narrowing. "If we set off a controlled explosion, it might be enough to free the kids before the guards can react." Logan swallowed, fully aware of the risk, but there was no other option. He nodded, locking eyes with Rachel. "Cover me. I'm going to move towards those containers." Rachel squeezed his hand briefly before letting go. "Be careful." Logan moved silently, using the shadows and chaos around him. He crept cautiously between the containers, sticking close to the walls and keeping a close eye on the men guarding the loading area. Each step brought him closer to the critical point. He could hear the clinking of the children's chains and their muffled sobs. When he reached the containers, he opened one of the small vents sticking out and poured all the flammable liquid he found onto the floor, ensuring the spill formed a line leading to a stack of crates further away. He lit a small lighter he had taken from one of the fallen guards and, without hesitation, tossed it towards the trail of liquid. "Go," he whispered, backing away quickly. The flame raced across the floor, snaking along until it reached the crates. A split second later, a deafening explosion rocked the hangar. The blast was so powerful that the walls shook, and a wave of searing heat shot up towards the ceiling, unleashing instant chaos. The guards shouted, some running towards the source of the fire, others raising their weapons, confused by the sudden blast. "Now!" Logan yelled, rising from his hiding spot. Rachel emerged from the shadows, firing accurately at the guards nearest the trucks. Logan charged toward the area where the children were, taking down 2 men who tried to react. Pandemonium erupted. The children's screams mingled with the frantic orders of the guards and the thunderous sound of gunfire reverberating through the cavernous hall. Logan pushed forward to one of the trucks. The children stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, some too scared to move. "Hurry, hurry, get out of here!" he shouted, cutting the ropes binding them with a knife he had seized from a guard. One by one, the children started to run, heading for the emergency exits. Rachel guided them, shooting any man who came too close. The chaos was absolute, but it worked to their advantage. The guards scattered, scrambling to contain the growing fire, while Logan and Rachel freed the young prisoners. But then, a gunshot rang out close to his ear. A guard had appeared behind him, his face twisted in a snarl of hatred. Before Logan could react, a force knocked him to the ground. "No!" Rachel screamed, trying to reach him. The guard raised his weapon, aiming at Logan's head. But in the last second, a small boy, no older than 6, leaped onto him, sinking his teeth into the man's arm with unexpected ferocity, giving Rachel the opening to shoot the guard in the leg, leaving him gasping in pain. As they continued forward, the building's flickering lights cast distorted shadows on the walls, and the echo of Logan and Rachel's footsteps reverberated through the empty corridors. Armed with weapons stolen from the guards, they moved stealthily, knowing the final confrontation was near. Adrenaline coursed through their veins like liquid fire. All around them, the abandoned building seemed to come alive, its walls whispering invisible threats. The children, disoriented and scared, followed them in a line, their small faces dirty but lit with a spark of renewed hope. Logan glanced at Rachel, who moved ahead with a clenched jaw and a determination that made her forget the pain of the bullet grazing her shoulder moments earlier. Blood stained her shirt, but she didn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to getting the children out of this hell. "Stay close to us," Logan whispered urgently but reassuringly to the children. "Don't get separated. Everything is going to be okay." The children, a dozen little ones they had rescued from the cages and locked rooms, nodded silently, following every move. Among them, Parker, the child who had triggered this entire nightmare, looked up at Logan with wide, dark eyes, clutching his hand as if it were his only link to reality. "We're almost out," Rachel murmured, pointing to an emergency exit at the end of the hallway. But just as they were a few steps away from the exit, a terrifying sound broke the silence, the sharp click of a gun being cocked. "Don't move." The voice, cold and controlled, made Logan and Rachel freeze. Slowly, they turned around and found themselves face to face with Victor Roberts. He wore a dark suit, his expression emotionless, but his eyes seethed with hatred and a dangerous calm. In his hand, a pistol gleamed under the dim light. Behind him, a group of armed men appeared in formation, blocking any hope of escape. "Did you really think you could just walk away with my products?" Roberts smirked, but it was a hollow smile, devoid of joy. "What a disappointment, Rachel. I thought you were smarter." "You're finished, Roberts," Rachel spat, breathing heavily from the pain in her arm. "We have proof. The police are on their way. If you kill me here, everything will come to light." Roberts looked at her with a coldness that chilled Logan's blood. "Proof?" He laughed softly, a sound that made the children shrink back in fear. "Do you really think that would stop me? Me?" His gaze sharpened, focusing on Logan. "Nobody in this system would dare lift a finger against me. But you," he tilted his head slightly, "you're the problem here. All this started because of you." Before Logan could react, Roberts raised the gun and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed hallway. Logan felt a sharp pain in his side and staggered backward. The impact stole his breath, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. He could hear the children's screams, the frantic noise of footsteps, and the echo of the gunshot reverberating in his ears. "No!" Rachel screamed, stepping forward, her face twisted in anguish. Roberts turned the gun toward Rachel, but before he could pull the trigger again, Logan, fighting against the pain searing through his body, lunged forward with a roar. He crashed into Roberts, slamming him against the wall. The pistol slipped from Roberts's hand, and the two of them fell to the ground, struggling violently. "Get out of here, Rachel! Get them out!" Logan shouted as he tried to pin Roberts's arm, who fought to reach the fallen weapon. "Not without you," she shot back, desperately looking for something to help with. But Roberts's men had already started moving, closing in around them. Rachel raised the gun she was carrying and fired blindly, forcing the henchmen to retreat momentarily. Then, without a second thought, she turned to the children. "Run!" she yelled, and, eyes wide with fear, the children started to dash toward the door. Parker lingered, staring at Logan with tear-filled eyes. "Run, Parker! Don't stop!" Logan shouted as he grappled with Roberts on the ground. The boy hesitated, but seeing the desperation on Rachel's face, he nodded and ran after the group, bursting through the door into the open air. Roberts seized a momentary distraction from Logan and, with a sudden twist, managed to break free. With one blow, he sent Logan crashing against the wall, and before he could react, Roberts pulled a knife from his belt. With a wild grin, he raised it, ready to drive it into Logan's chest. "This is the end for you." But before he could strike, Rachel appeared behind him. With a shout, she struck him on the head with the butt of her gun. Roberts staggered, dropping the knife, which clattered loudly to the ground. Logan took advantage of the moment, and with what little strength he had left, jumped up and shoved him with all the force he could muster. Roberts lost his balance and fell backward, crashing into a stack of old crates that toppled over him. "Let's go," Rachel gasped, grabbing Logan's arm and helping him to his feet. They stumbled toward the door, panting with the effort. Roberts's men, momentarily stunned, began shooting, but Logan and Rachel were already moving. They sprinted through the hallway, bullets whizzing past until they finally burst through the emergency exit and into the cool night air. The fresh night air hit their faces, and the sound of the children's sobs and gasps filled the atmosphere. Rachel looked around, making sure everyone was there. Parker was right beside her, his cheeks stained with tears. "Is everyone okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. The children nodded, trembling but alive. "We have to keep moving," Logan said, breathing heavily, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. "Roberts will be coming after us with everything he's got." But at that moment, a distant sound of sirens broke the silence. Rachel looked up and saw, far off, the red and blue lights of police cars speeding toward them. "The police?" she whispered in disbelief. Logan let out a bitter laugh. "We did it," he murmured, before collapsing to the ground, his body finally giving in to the pain and exhaustion. "Logan!" Rachel cried, kneeling beside him, her face pale with fear. But he gave her a weak smile. Everything's going to be fine, Rachel. We did it. They're safe." The sirens grew louder, and the car doors slammed open as officers began to surround them, weapons aimed at the building. But when they saw the children and Rachel kneeling beside Logan, everything changed. The guns lowered, and paramedics rushed toward them. "Help! Please help him!" Rachel shouted. The officers moved quickly, securing the area and escorting the children. As the paramedics attended to Logan, Rachel allowed herself a sigh of relief. She looked back and saw Roberts being dragged out of the building, handcuffed and covered in dust, his face contorted with rage. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like they could finally breathe. They had won, but the cost had been high. Logan, on the stretcher, closed his eyes with a final smile on his lips as the world faded around him. And Rachel, with tears in her eyes, vowed she would not let that sacrifice be in vain. The police sirens echoed through the night, lighting up the isolated property where the final battle had been fought. The red and blue flashes painted the ground in vibrant and almost surreal colors. Officers stormed the complex, arresting every kidnapper they encountered, some still dazed by the intensity of the fight that had just ended. The scene was controlled chaos, agents running, paramedics attending to the wounded, and terrified children clinging to any adult who offered them a shred of comfort. Rachel staggered, leaning against a nearby wall, watching everything with a sense of unreality. She hadn't yet processed what had just happened. The sound of the weapons, the kidnappers' screams, and Roberts's final shot, which still echoed in her mind like a persistent echo. It was all a blur of intertwined images and sounds, but the vision she couldn't shake was Logan, collapsing to the ground, his chest soaked in blood, his face twisted in pain before darkness claimed him. "We need a stretcher here," one of the paramedics shouted, running toward her. "I'm fine," Rachel managed to murmur, raising her hand weakly to direct them toward the children being freed. One of the officers, a burly man with a hardened face, stopped beside her. "Rachel Vargas?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "That's me." The man looked at her with respect, as if seeing someone from another world. "I want you to know that what you did here saved many lives," he said quietly. "No one had dared to stand up to Roberts like this. And thanks to you and your partner, it's finally over." The words felt empty, hollow. Rachel looked around, watching as the children were lifted into ambulances, as the metal cuffs closed around the kidnappers' wrists one by one. Roberts had been subdued and arrested, the gleam of his arrogance finally extinguished. Despite his capture, his expression of hatred and defiance hadn't faded. He knew he would face justice, but the price had been too high. Logan hadn't survived. Rachel closed her eyes tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. The last thing she had seen before he fell had been his determined face, covered in blood, refusing to give up. Despite everything, he had kept fighting. He had protected the children, he had confronted Roberts, and in the end, he had sacrificed his life to ensure it all ended. The ambulance carrying Logan passed by her, and Rachel felt a sharp pain in her chest at the sight of his body covered with a sheet. There had been no heroic death on the battlefield, no stirring speeches, just a man who had given everything he had to save those who couldn't save themselves. "Thank you," she murmured softly, whispering into the wind that brushed against her face. It was the only thing she could say. The following days were a mixture of chaos and calm, like the treacherous calm that follows a devastating storm. Rachel spent most of her time helping organize care for the rescued children. Some of them were in shock, others cried uncontrollably, and a few remained in absolute silence, as if their spirits had been broken beyond repair. Each of them had their own horror story. Some spoke of the terrible conditions they had endured, of promises of a home, only to find themselves in a nightmare. Others couldn't speak at all, and Rachel would sit with them, hoping that the words would come someday, if they ever did. The media echoed the operation, covering the story with impactful headlines. Largest child trafficking network in the region dismantled. Victor Roberts, businessman and monster, arrested. But all the recognition, the congratulations, the interviews, none of it mattered to Rachel. Every word of praise only added more weight to the burden she carried in her heart. Logan's funeral was modest. Just a few people, a priest, and Rachel standing beside little Lucia, who stared at the grave with eyes full of questions and sorrow. Rachel had wanted to speak to the girl, to tell her how hard her father had fought to ensure the world was a safer place for her and others like her. But when the child looked up, Rachel knew no words could fill the void Logan had left. "Was Daddy a hero?" Lucia asked in a trembling voice, her hands clutching at Rachel's skirt. "Yes, Lucia," Rachel whispered, kneeling to her height. "He was. More than I can express in words." Lucia didn't reply. She only stared at the headstone, at the simplicity of the name engraved in marble. Logan Bennett, father, friend, hero. Rachel spent the following days alone, immersed in a routine that no longer made sense. She had spent so much time chasing Roberts and his network, trying to gather evidence, building the case, fighting a corrupt system. Now that the battle was over, she felt empty, as if her purpose had vanished along with Logan's life. One afternoon, as she sat in the small cafe they used to frequent during their planning days, she looked out the window and let the memories flow. She remembered the conversations, the plans, the brief laughs, and the moments of despair. But most of all, she remembered the promise Logan had made to her. If we fall together. But these kids, they have to make it. They have to have a chance to live without fear. Rachel wiped away a solitary tear and took a deep breath. They had fallen. Logan had fallen. But the children, they were safe now. The chains that bound them had been broken. The price had been steep, but it had been paid. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion in every fiber of her being. But there was also a spark of determination. She couldn't give up, not after everything that had happened. There were other children, other places where evil still lurked. And even though Logan was no longer by her side, his memory and his sacrifice would guide her. As she left the cafe and walked through the quiet city streets, Rachel looked up at the clear sky. She felt the wind brush against her face and closed her eyes, letting the pain mix with a renewed resolve. Logan had died fighting for what he believed in. Now it was her turn to live to protect that legacy. Meanwhile, the temporary orphanage where Parker had been taken after the raid was a place of silence. The grey brick building, with windows covered in bars and a garden that must have once been beautiful, looked more like a prison than a refuge. Parker, sitting in a corner of the common room, watched the other children playing in the yard with the same absent expression he had worn since he was rescued. The others ran, shouted, and laughed, trying to leave behind the shadows of the past, but he couldn't. He still felt the darkness tightening around his chest, the memories of the horrors he had endured slipping like poison into his thoughts. Every loud sound made him flinch. Every adult's gaze filled him with fear. He couldn't help it. He had spent so long feeling like an object, something worthless, that now it was hard to believe it was all over. Sometimes he would close his eyes and see himself again in that damp cell, surrounded by dirty walls and the acrid smell of mold and sweat. He remembered the voices that promised terrible things, that threatened him and reduced him to nothing more than a frightened body in a dark corner. When he thought of those days, the faces of the other children who shared his prison appeared before him. Some looked younger, others older, but all had the same empty expression and eyes full of fear. He remembered how they were forced to remain silent for hours, not moving, not speaking. If they broke the rules, the punishments came: beatings, hunger, isolation in even darker and colder rooms. A shiver ran through him as he recalled the creak of the door opening and the tall shadow of one of the kidnappers slowly approaching with a belt in hand. There were nights when he thought he would die there, that he would never see the sunlight again, and he had almost resigned himself to that fate. Now Logan was no longer there, not after what happened that night in the warehouse. Rachel, who visited him often, always carried an aura of sadness, as if the light within her had gone out. But today, as she sat beside him in the common room, something was different. She held a small cardboard box in her hands and a serious expression on her face. "Hello, Parker," she said softly, kneeling to be at his level. Parker looked at her without responding. He had learned to be cautious, not to show emotions, not to expect anything. Rachel sighed and set the box on the floor in front of him. "I want to talk to you about Logan," she said gently, her voice barely a whisper in the cold air of the room. "I don't know if anyone has told you, but he's not here. He died saving you." The words fell like stones in the silence. Parker felt a knot form in his stomach, but he didn't look away from Rachel. She took a deep breath, as if gathering strength. Logan wasn't a perfect hero. He was... She fell silent for a moment, searching for the right words. He was someone who had made mistakes, who had lost a lot. But when he found you, when he read your note, he decided he couldn't keep running anymore. She leaned in a little closer, her gaze intense but filled with tenderness. "He fought for you, Parker. He did things no one else would have done, risked everything, even his life, all for a child he didn't even know." Parker's eyes filled with tears, but he held them back, blinking hard. Rachel leaned forward, getting on his eye level. "Logan found the note, Parker, and he didn't stop until he found you." Rachel's voice trembled slightly, remembering everything they had been through together. "You know, he was very scared too, but he never gave up. Even when everyone told him he couldn't do anything, even when they beat him and almost killed him, he kept fighting. For you and for the other children." Parker looked at her with wide eyes. For me? Why?" Rachel smiled sadly, feeling a mix of pain and pride. "Because he saw something in you. Because he knew that if he didn't help you, no one else would. It was his way of giving meaning to his life after everything he'd been through." Parker shrank a little in his seat, feeling the tears welling up in his eyes. He felt ashamed. Why would someone do that for him? A broken child, a child who couldn't even protect himself. "Before it all ended," Rachel continued, her voice shaking, "Logan left something for you, something he wanted you to have." With trembling hands, she opened the box and took out a small photograph. Parker leaned in to look. It was a picture of a girl with big, bright eyes and a smile that seemed to light up everything around her. "This is Lucia, Logan's daughter." Parker stared at the photo intently. Something warm and strange stirred in his chest as he saw the girl's smile. Lucia? Logan's daughter? Did he have a daughter? Why wasn't he with her? Rachel seemed to read his thoughts because she nodded slowly. Logan couldn't be with her. He lost her for a while, and when he decided to fight for you, he did it thinking of Lucia too. He wanted her to grow up in a world where children were safe. Tears started to run down Rachel's face, but she didn't wipe them away. He wanted you to meet Lucia. He wanted you to know that you're not alone. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Parker looked at the photo, feeling the warmth transform into something else, a small spark of hope and curiosity. What kind of person was Lucia? Why had Logan fought so hard to save him? He wanted you to be okay, Parker, Rachel said, her voice breaking. He wanted you to move forward, because in you, he saw something more. He saw a second chance. And I think Lucia deserves to meet you. She smiled sadly, gently caressing the corner of the photo. You deserve to know the full story of Logan, not just the part where he sacrificed himself, but the part where he found the strength to fight. And that's something only you can decide. Parker stared at the photo for a long time, his heart racing, his emotions swirling. Rachel's words took root deep inside him. Could he meet Lucia? Could he tell her about her father, the man who had saved him? For the first time since he was rescued, he felt something stronger than fear, something bigger than the darkness surrounding him. Can I see her? He finally asked, his voice trembling. Rachel nodded, smiling through her tears. Yes, Parker, of course you can. She's waiting for you. And so, with the small photo of Lucia in his hands and a new purpose in his heart, Parker decided he wouldn't let the shadows of the past define his future. Because Logan had given his life for him, and he wasn't going to let that sacrifice be in vain. The morning sun gently filtered through the orphanage windows, filling Parker's room with a golden light. He stood in front of the mirror, looking at himself closely. He was no longer the frail, frightened child of years past. He had grown, and his reflection now showed a tall young man with broad shoulders and a determined gaze. His eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with a spark of resolution. The barely visible scar on his cheek reminded him of the dark times he had lived through. But it also reminded him that he had survived, that he had moved forward, despite everything. Today was the day he had been waiting for so long. The day he turned 18, the day he was finally free. The memories of the last 5 years in the orphanage mingled in his mind as he finished packing his few belongings. Some books he had collected, a couple of notebooks where he wrote his thoughts, and the blurry photo of Logan that he had guarded jealously. He had wanted to leave the orphanage much earlier, but the legal system was a maze that trapped children like him. He had no known family, and despite Rachel's efforts to get him out, he was never allowed to leave under her custody. So he had waited until he could leave on his own. "You're ready, Parker," the orphanage director, a gray-haired man with a severe expression that rarely showed emotion, said to him. "Today, you start a new life." Parker nodded, grateful for the stability the orphanage had given him, but knowing that stability had come at a cost: freedom. Now that chapter was closing. The past was behind him. When he stepped out of the orphanage gates with a small backpack over his shoulder, the outside world welcomed him with its chaotic bustle. The noise of cars, the murmur of conversations, and the fresh air felt strange and familiar at the same time. He had spent so long in that isolated bubble that the real world almost felt unreal. Parker stopped on the sidewalk and took a deep breath, allowing himself to take it all in for the first time. People walked briskly, their faces focused on their own destinations, as if trapped in their own whirlwind of routines. Around him, the buildings towered imposingly, with their glass and steel facades reflecting the blue sky. He looked at his hands, and then at the surroundings, feeling out of place. Where did he fit into all this? Freedom was overwhelming. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times, wondering what he would do first, when he could walk the streets without restrictions, without anyone watching him or telling him what to do. But now that he was finally there, he felt like a stranger in an unknown land. Freedom, he murmured to himself, testing the word on his lips. But freedom came at a price. He knew that in the outside world, he was just a young man without a name, without a past, and without a secure future. But he had a purpose, a mission that had kept him strong all these years. He wanted to honor Logan, the man who had given his life to save him. He wanted to meet his daughter, Lucia, the girl Logan had loved so much and for whom he had sacrificed himself. Parker walked for hours, exploring the streets with a mix of curiosity and caution. It was the first time he could decide where to go, which path to take. The people who saw him pass paid him no attention, just another young man in the big city. Crossing a busy street, he stopped in front of a tech store window. The bright ads of the latest devices blinked, and Parker watched as others entered and exited, buying things that were unfamiliar to him. The world had changed while he was trapped. Phones were smaller, screens were bigger, and people seemed to be constantly caught in some kind of virtual conversation. He wondered how many of those people knew how lucky they were to live in freedom, to make decisions for themselves. Parker didn't have a phone, didn't even know how to use one of the modern ones. He didn't have a bank account or enough money to settle down. All he had was the address Rachel had given him years ago, Lucia's address. He had written letters to that address many times, letters he never sent because he didn't know what to say. How did you tell someone that their father had died saving you? How did you explain the pain and guilt of being the only survivor? Doubts flooded him as he made his way to a nearby park to rest. He sat on a bench, watching the leaves on the trees sway gently in the breeze. Children laughed and ran, oblivious to the horrors the world could hide. Seeing them brought back memories of his stolen childhood. But he wasn't going to let himself be defeated by the pain, not after everything he had been through. "I'll do it for him," he murmured. He stood up and walked to the address he had memorized in his mind. He knew that Lucia was now 16. What would she be like? Would she remember anything about her father? Had Rachel told her the truth about what happened? Parker felt a weight in his chest as he thought about what he would say, but he knew he had to do it. He had to close that chapter of his life to truly start anew. When he arrived at the address Rachel had given him, a chill ran down his spine. It was a modest house on the outskirts of the city, with a small front yard and a blue-painted mailbox. Parker stood in front of the entrance, feeling the weight of every step he took. The words he had rehearsed over and over again vanished from his mind, but there was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and raised his hand to knock on the door. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was about to do something that would change his life forever. The door slowly opened, and a young girl with light brown hair and green eyes appeared in the doorway. She had a familiar air, the same look of strength and determination he had seen in Logan. Parker's eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Lucia looked at him with curiosity, blinking as she tried to figure out who the stranger at her door was. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. Parker swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. Everything he had wanted to say, the words of gratitude and promises of protection, remained stuck. But he forced himself to speak, knowing that this was the moment he had been waiting for so long. He began to say, but stopped, unsure. Lucia's eyes narrowed slightly, as if something about him seemed familiar. Then Parker gathered his courage and said, "I'm Parker, the boy your father saved." Lucia stood still, surprise and confusion fighting for control of her expression. Parker didn't look away, waiting, watching. In his heart, there were a million questions and hopes. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer alone. "Do you want to come in?" she finally asked, opening the door a little wider. Parker nodded, stepping into the house with a firm step. Because, even though the pain of the past still followed him, this time He was there to fulfill the promise he had made to Logan. And so, with an uncertain future before him, the door closed behind them, leaving a myriad of possibilities. What would happen from now on? Would they seek revenge against the man who hurt them so deeply, talk and unburden themselves of everything that had happened, or work to uphold Logan's legacy? Only life would decide, but whatever it was, the story was yet to be written. Thank you for watching this exciting story. If you liked it and want to see a second part, leave us a comment and don't forget to subscribe for more living memories like this one. See you next time.